Welcome to Integral Talks, a podcast series brought to you by Integral Advisors, where we dive into the world of compliance, risk management, and due diligence, and provide you with expert insight and analysis to help you make more informed business decisions. Hello and welcome back to our podcast. I'm your host, Alberto de la Portilla. Thank you for tuning in and for subscribing. Today we continue our podcast series forecasting the impact of a second Trump administration on different sectors of the economy. During our first episode of 2025, we covered mergers and acquisitions between the U.S. and Latin America. Last month, we covered the impact on banking and regulatory compliance. Feel free to check out those episodes at your leisure. In today's episode, we will discuss immigration and the flow of remittances. As you know, remittances are funds sent by immigrants back to their home countries to support their families. In 2024, foreign remittances totaled somewhere around $655 billion globally. Some data shows that this number is as high as $850 billion. Remittances play a significant role in the economies of countries in Central America. Funds from the U.S. to Latin America and the Caribbean totaled somewhere around $170 billion in 2024. But President Trump's immigration policy, which has been the subject of daily news reports, as the president follows through on a campaign promise to crack down on illegal immigration, is certain to impact the flow of funds back to these countries, and an industry of providers and consumers and recipients who rely on remittances on a day-to-day basis. To shed some light on this, I've invited Manuel Orozco to the podcast. Manuel is Director of Migration, Remittances, and Development at the Inter-American Dialogue, a leading think tank based in Washington, D.C., focused on fostering governance, prosperity, and social equity in Latin America and the Caribbean. He also serves as a senior fellow at Harvard University's Center for International Development and as a senior advisor with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Manuel, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you. This is obviously a very, I think it's very topical to discuss immigration and remittances. I want to first start off just kind of bigger picture, and I want to make sure I had some of my data right. So I mentioned in my intro about $170 billion in 2024 in terms of remittance volume to Latin America. Is that about accurate?
Correct. It's Mexico is the leading $66 billion, and then you have countries like Guatemala with $21 billion. So both of them together do more than half of the total volume to the region.
And so, and then as far as, I think for the audience, it would be very beneficial to hear from you a little bit about the Inter-American Dialogue and the role that it has played. I know you've been there for, more than 20 years. What? Tell us a little bit more about the Inter-American Dialogue.
We're a think tank that started in the 1980s. Predominantly, we try to bring a dialogue among different players during the political crisis in Central America. And it evolved in tandem with political and economic events in the region. I came to lead the Central America program in 2000, and now I manage the Migration, Remittances, and Development program. Our focus is predominantly to bring stakeholders, policy analysts, policymakers to think about policy solutions to problems that the region faces. In the case of my program, we focus on the flow of remittances. I designed the transaction cost methodology in 1998 to understand how expensive it was to send money at that time. Then we brought the issue of financial inclusion as a key factor connected to remittance transactions. And more recently, we also brought issues relating to competition in the money transfer industry. So developed a scorecard on the industry since 2006, and we keep up with trying to bring light to give insights into competition in the industry, economic development related to remittances, and of course, the migration leg, how migration shapes the flow of money.
Okay. When I asked you about the the volumes going back to Latin America and the Caribbean of 170 billion. Is that number based on data through just formal channels? I've read just in preparing for this podcast that there are also informal channels to send money back, and so that number of 170 billion might be even more. Is that
it could be more, but
yeah.
I mean, in this day and age, by 2025, I will say at least 95% of all flows go through license mechanisms,
Right.
through money transfer companies that have a
Right.
license to operate. There is a significant demand for money transfer by individuals using regulated systems. So when I started looking at this in 2000, the volume was $24 billion. Just to give you some...
In 2000, okay.
Yes, that's 25 years ago.
25 years.
It was $24 billion from 14 countries. Now those 14 countries today are $155 billion. So you can understand the magnitude of the flow, but at that time, it was somewhere around 70% license and 30% informal. There's never an informal per se type of transaction. There is a hybrid. A money service business has a license to operate on certain things, but you used to have travel agencies sending money to Cuba, for example, the so-called paqueticos, or we also call them las mulas. But you also have travelers, encomenderos, viajeros, going to El Salvador to take money in small envelopes and deliver it. And there was all on license, but the business that was doing that had a registration to operate commercial transactions. So it's not exactly informal, but there is something in the middle that is not licensed.
And obviously 2025, we all have, phones. And so there are mobile apps that facilitate remittances. So there's a lot more options for migrants.
Yeah,
Yes,
I can
right.
I can decide to send money through my app. Next month, I'll just walk into a store and send the money in cash. It's not a zero-sum process that you either use one or the other.
Right.
But there is definitely a ubiquitous process today in using your mobile app to send money because you use it for other things. So
Yeah.
Remittance transactions is just one payment that you're making in addition to all your other financial obligations and payments.
So let's talk about what's happening today. You read on a day-to-day basis about what's happening with different sort of immigration-related news, right? The ICE going into different countries or states, deporting people. So, are we are we like in a mass deportation stage of this immigration policy? How would you define what's happening today versus the first Trump administration? Is it far more aggressive today, or?
It is definitely, the rhetoric is far more aggressive. The practice is more complicated than expelling millions of people. So you have to consider a number of variables. One is the manpower and how available to deport people. Two is the probability that you can get people. And that's basically looking at those populations at risk of deportation. People who have a deportation order, people whose time in the United States has expired, among other things, people with a conviction who were supposed to return by law but did not. So all of those become a mass, a critical mass of 3.5 million people. The most likely to deport are 1.5 million people who have deportation orders since 2018. Paradoxically, they are not the same. They're not proportionally distributed along the migrant population. These people with deportation orders are people who are coming from politically difficult countries: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, and Haiti. So it's kind of counterintuitive to deal with a situation where you have people at risk of deportation going back to countries that are really uh, the root cause of the migration to begin with. And on the other hand, having a policy against dictatorships that doesn't want those dictators to continue exporting migrants.
Do you, so as far as the remittances, I've read that at least initially, the impact has been mixed on the flow of remittances. So I know we're only 3 months into this administration, 3.5 months, but there is some narrative that fear of deportation, restrictions on visas was, sort of increased flow of funds from some of the migrants back to their countries. But then also, deportations have led to a reduction in funds going back to Latin America. So, and I know we're early in 2025, but what does your data show as far as and I did look, by the way, I did see some of the data that you provided. You sent me something yesterday, and I do appreciate that. But in general, can you just tell the audience, what does the data show so far in 2025 vis-a-vis remittances?
Look, the first quarter shows an even distribution in terms of the growth compared to the growth pattern of the past 5 years, from 2021 more or less to now. Some countries have increased, that is, their growth in the flows is a little bit above the average. That's Guatemala. It has had the quarter an average of 19% increase. And you can attribute that mostly to migration. And then you have other countries like Honduras that has been more or less steady, the same growth pattern from previous quarters, which is somewhat about 10%. And then Mexico does not have growth. The first quarter for Mexico, it's about 1% growth. So you have an uneven distribution that is more associated to migration patterns to some extent than to anecdotes that say that migrants are afraid of being deported and therefore they're sending as much money as they can. But there might be an element of truth to it too. I think migrants may feel that it's time to send a bit more just in case. But at the same time, in this age where you have your money in your wallet, but your mobile wallet, that means you have a bank account. It means that no matter what happens to you physically, your money is accessible anywhere you are.
Right.
And migrants know that.
Okay, right. So then looking out towards second, third, and fourth quarter, let's stay with this being kind of near term. What do you forecast the impact that the administration will have on not only immigration, but more specifically on the flow of funds back to the home countries by migrants?
Look, I think you have three variables to factor in. One is migration. Migration was already slowing down. This year, migration, regardless of who was in charge in the U.S. government, was going to be half of what it was last year.
Let me ask you, why is that?
Because migration had been in the slowdown for the past 3 years, since 2023. And as a result of the fact that you had a large outflow of people leaving their home countries, especially Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, you have 800,000 people migrating in the past 6 years because of political conditions in that country. Venezuelans it's a large number of nearly 1 million people in the United States. Then you have Hondurans also leaving their home country because of political conditions. Then Cubans and of course the Haitian crisis. So, but the size of the population that left was so large that it diminished the size of the labor force in the home countries. So in order for you to migrate, your intention to migrate is connected to the need to take care of your family in the home country. But if if the need is not only financial, monetary, but you also need to be there to take care of them, then your intention to migrate decreases. So since the working age population has to take care of kids and people of the third age, then you decided to stay. And so the slowing down was taking place, let's say, demographically, and there was definitely a decline. So the second factor is deportation. So the projected number of deportations is about 500,000, but it's a number, again, that doesn't correspond to the migrant population. So the largest bulk of people deported are not going to be Mexicans, for example, which you have 11 million people in the United States. It's going to be Venezuelans, Asians, etc. And so your impact is uneven. And then there is a third variable that, unfortunately, we have to calculate, and that's the recession. The effect of the recession, a 1% increase in unemployment among migrants decreases the flow of remittances by 2% or more. So when you capture those three factors together, my projection was at most, 4% growth in remittances this year.
And compared to previous year?
Last year.
So, okay.
But it's not as large as well.
So
I think
almost,
it all depends on
almost a 50%.
where things continue on 2026.
So speaking about recession, the U.S. economy, obviously, a strong U.S. economy or a weak U.S. economy has an impact on nearby countries, particularly, and migration. If the jobs that migrants are typically hired for, agriculture, hospitality, construction. I live in South Florida, construction, services industry. If there is a decrease in labor from those countries, I mean, do you see this rhetoric that's happening in Washington and the actions taken by the administration having a chilling effect on those specific industries? Do you forecast that?
I mean, with the recession, you will have unemployment in different sectors, and construction is already dealing with problems in hiring people because there is a slowdown in construction. So, and 1/3 of the male population, migrant population, works in construction. I mean, in the United States, half of the labor force in construction is migrant. So you can see that if there is a contraction in the construction sector, the first group that will pay the bill will be migrants, because they are basically half of the labor force. Then you have other categories. Domestic work is another one. More than agricultural work, I see people working in the urban sector more affected by the recession and by unemployment among migrants. So, we may be dealing with significant loss of labor, which will impact also the U.S. economy.
Right, which will then obviously has a ripple effect on the economies of Central America, or those, for example, Guatemala, Nicaragua, those that have historically, the migrants have been coming from those countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela, in Nicaragua. Remittances obviously in the past have, and still today, I suppose, represent a significant percentage of the GDP of those countries. I understand.
Even for Mexico, it's almost 4% of Mexico's GDP. It's the largest source of foreign exchange.
And outside of Mexico, like I was looking at some data, like in Honduras and in Salvador. I don't know if these numbers are current, but I saw somewhere between 24 to 27% of the GDP. Is that about right?
Yeah, 24% for El Salvador, 27% for Honduras, 21% for Guatemala, which is a country with a population of 18 million people, $80 billion economy. And Nicaragua is almost 30% of GDP. So any effect that you have, the way to think about it, it's, yes, the volume. You will see a decline in the volume, may not be as large, but the most important effect is at the household level. Take, for example, the case of Nicaragua. Nicaragua has 1.5 million households in the entire country. It's a country with 6.5 million people. And in that case, you have about 1 million household to household transactions through Nicaragua. So a decline in 50,000 transactions a month means that there will be 50,000 households that will not receive money on that year. And that's an impact, at the local economy. Same thing is with Honduras. With Guatemala, the number may be 75,000 households not receiving remittances. So, and yes, it's 2.5 million households. And you can say, well, but that's just a tiny percentage. But if it was my house, I'll be in a lot of trouble because I don't have any other sources of income.
In some of these countries, and it's just, I think I heard in El Salvador they do this just on the regulatory side. Do these countries tax or any remittance inflows into their countries from the U.S.? Is there a fee? I know, for example, a Western Union will charge its fee or MoneyGram, but does the home country receive any kind of benefit economically directly? Obviously, there's a benefit to their residents spending money, but do any of these countries tax these remittances?
No, the revenue that the government obtains from remittances is through the value-added tax, because about 90% of that flow is spent for consumption activities. You may save 10% of your money, but you do spend most of the money in education, in healthcare, in food, clothing, etc. So that, for a country like El Salvador, for example, is about 13% VAT. So it comes to be at least 20% of tax revenue that is derived from remittance flows. So this is the key segment of revenue that the state you can have. But remittances per se are not taxed as part of the income bracket. In practical terms, if you pay your taxes, if you register and report your taxes, your income tax, you obviously would include remittances. But in these countries, still, it's only a fraction of the population that actually pays income taxes. Because it's an informal economy, it's still a long way to go to deal with that.
On the U.S. side, I know that there are several states that are considering taxing remittances. I know that there is a bill, I think, proposed in the U.S. In Washington to try to tax. Do you have any updates on the status of any of this and what could be the impact on taxing of remittances outgoing?
These are moving targets. So the discussion of taxing remittance has always been there. The proposals have been in different state legislative floors. Most of the time they do not pass. The only one that has been successful was the one in Oklahoma. There's been other legislative proposals in Alabama, in Florida, Utah, and a few other states. And they're still, debated, pushed back, shelved, etc. There is a proposal by then Senator Vance to tax remittances. It's a lot of these proposals are based on incorrect assumptions and inaccurate data or false data. People provide information from a report that it was in the end taken up by the organization that talked about illicit flow of money that used the money transfer vehicles for that. And it was never proven, it was false, etc. But that's been the basis of a lot of this proposed legislation. So I don't foresee it being approved, but it's toxic, and it becomes a real hassle to deal with all of these issues in front of the fact that you have all these other political problems going on. right now on the migration and remittances landscape.
I don't quite see the motive behind these efforts to tax remittances. I could see where the pushback would come from the providers of those remittances. And it seems like it's more sort of based on or informed and motivated by political rhetoric and this sort of anti-immigration narrative that exists today more so than it did, 10 years ago.
The motivation is mostly political. Unfortunately, migration, and this is, a fact of American political culture, has been a contentious issue, one of the most dividing political issues over, the history of the United States is migration. You either are for or against it. And overall, the majority of Americans tend to have a positive view of migration, but the political map may change decisions over how to deal with that. But there is a significant undermining of facts. So, and in Washington, when opinions prevail over facts, you get a nuclear bomb.
Yeah. I want to talk about, because now we're getting into, our world as a, my world is the world of risk management, compliance, due diligence, sanctions. FinCEN issued a geographic targeting order recently. They've had it for years, but now they've lowered the threshold of reporting that MSB is required from, I think originally it was around $3,000. I don't recall that number, but now it's down to $200.
It's always been 3,000. The money transfer industry has a self-regulatory component, self-compliant part, where they basically monitor any transaction above $1,000. They flag it, they study it, and then they release it or they report it as a suspicious activity. And now there are a series of locations across the U.S.-Mexico border, that targets the $200 mark, which is, I think we will be talking about at least 20% of the outbound money transfer, because there is a large concentration of migrants in California and other zip codes. I can figure out the politics of FinCEN, but the technicalities of it, the arguments, they are not demonstrated. Let me put it this way. In order to perform an illicit financial transaction using the money transfer rails, it will be very costly for you, because the average transaction is around $300. And if you're laundering money, for example, it's just way too expensive to send small dollar transactions to launder the average money laundered amount is over $50,000. So, it's terribly counterintuitive. So there is no technical logic to it, other than the political push against migrants and money service businesses.
Yeah, and I could see, obviously, the administration has talked about refocusing efforts from Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to FinCEN towards the Mexican cartels, and so obviously that's the entre comillas the target. But I can see where this could be quite a burden for these companies, these money service businesses that have to now report anything over that $200 threshold. So
and FinCEN knows.
And FinCEN knows, and FinCEN is still moving forward. Mexico is interesting. I'm curious, your data shows, and you mentioned it earlier, that Mexico's growth of remittances has dropped, I think, to like 2%, whereas 5-year average was about 11%. What do you see happening? Obviously, there's been a lot of talk between Mexico and the U.S., no tariffs on Mexico so far. Some, I guess, reasonable discussions, if you read the news, between the U.S. administration and the Mexican president. where do you see Mexico falling in as far as migration and remittances in the coming years? And the coming year, I should say. I want to talk more near term.
It's a mixed set of issues. The first one is that because migration was slowing down, you do have a situation of declining remittances to Mexico. The second factor is that the majority of migrants coming from Mexico are actually authorized migrants, not irregular migrants, because you have a large bulk of people that come under the H-2A visas, the agricultural visas, and they represent at least 400,000 people. So the number of annual transaction increase comes from people who are on an authorized status, temporary but authorized. The number of irregular transactions was about 200,000 a year. So that's where your slowing down is going to take place, unless the administration decides to also cut down in the guest worker visas. Now, the other side of the equation to this that is problematic is the tariff side. It will have an effect on the demand for foreign labor. And if your demand for foreign labor becomes scarce because you are deporting people and because less migrants are available, then you're faced with a difficult economic situation for small businesses predominantly, because small businesses are the ones that are going to pay most of the cost of the tariffs, but also they are the ones who are going to pay for the cost of the deportation of migrants. So the case of Mexico may illustrate a situation that is basically torpedoing yourself on economic policies and migration policy.
Yeah, we haven't talked about tariffs. That's true. I mean, tariffs...
Well, tariffs make things more expensive. So you look for cheap labor, and you won't find it because
you won't find it with the American worker, right? The American worker to build cars, for example, is going to cost 3 times as much as, someone in a foreign country. Yeah, it's a challenge, the issue related to tariffs and what it's going to do to the economy and different sectors of the economy in the short term.
In the short term.
But yeah, it's very interesting. And I wanted to ask you also, as far as the Inter-American Dialogue, your organization, in past years, you had interaction with the previous administrations, working with foreign policy advocates within. Is that right? I mean, because I would imagine you're doing this, but you're also feeding some of this data to decision makers in Washington, correct? Is that accurate? And then what has been the relationship under this administration between the Inter-American Dialogue and...
Yes, the dialogue, what it does is brings a number of players to sit and discuss policy issues, and that includes U.S. government institutions, USAID, for example, which was disbanded, the State Department, people from Treasury, among other players in the government, participated in a dialogue, in an exchange over issues and ideas on how to find solutions to given problems. One of them was the root causes of migration, for example. And yes, we presented, for the previous administration, we made the case with evidence, with data, that the migration problem was directly a foreign policy problem, more than just an economic issue. That the people that were migrating from places where there is serious rule of law problems, democracy and governance problems, corruption, and that the United States needed to focus on that while at the same time was protecting the border. And I think there was a reluctance at the time, but there was a hearing. They listened. Today, we're not even close to 3 months with the new administration. I think the approach, the lesson learned from the previous Trump administration is that they want to keep a close-knit circle of engagement and communication. And even within the staff at the State Department, the political appointed people do not communicate fully with the local staff, with the State Department, for example. It's a slow process. I think there will be communication because at the end of the day, you need to explain your ideas and show the impact and the success, because the administration wants to show that it's been successful at deportations beyond the media show. The politics of the spectacle are obvious, uh, but beyond that, you want to see an impact. And I think that's where they will reach to us. And of course, we also reach out to them, um, because at the end of the day, we all want the same purpose, to have more peaceful societies, but also prosperous. And a lot of it coincides with Secretary Rubio's foreign policy approach. You know, prosperous, protected uh, United States.
Have you had much interaction with the Secretary of State?
No, no, we
No.
want
Okay.
to, because I think
Sure.
in foreign policy terms, the the mission of the dialogue is pretty much in sync with the perspective of Secretary Rubio when it comes to the basics of trade, not tariffs themselves, but the need, for example, to revisit and renegotiate the Central America Free Trade Agreement with the United States, with the issue of
Mm-hmm.
migration, how to connect it more with development, with the issue of deportation, returning people but in a safer context, and with the issue
Right.
of democracy. Secretary Rubio has a perspective that says that it's important to deal with those transgressors of the global liberal order, and that includes dictatorship. And Latin America has 5 dictatorships at least. So, or 6 if you include El Salvador, which no one wants to talk
Mm.
about very much. But you have
Right.
Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, St. Vincent. Nobody knows much about this small island, but President Gonzalez
Oh.
is someone who's been in power for 16 years.
Mm.
Ralph Gonzalez. And so you
Yeah.
do
In
have
Cuba.
different non-democratic societies in Latin America for which the United States need to exercise a foreign policy approach. So there is a lot of commonalities.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how. I know we're in the very early stages of the administration. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. And there's so much happening right now with the tariffs and the impact on the economy, and people in Wall Street saying, we're heading into a recession, um, and how all that factors into the migrant that just wants to come here or wants to stay here and came here for the purpose of just working their tail off in order to send funds back to for their families. I was speaking to someone yesterday who actually is from the Ukraine, and came over with another person. They started a business there, but then they relocated here to Florida because of the war, and I asked them if and when the war is over, will they go back? And they said they would. And do you see? And I guess I know it depends on it's on the family and on the situation. But do you see? Yesterday, for example, I think yesterday that a judge allowed the administration to now enforce a requirement that anyone who's here illegally must register. I saw that in the news. And so I think they're trying to just really document how many people here illegally. Do you see people eventually going back voluntarily? Like they want to go back, they want to, perhaps, regain some kind of nationalistic pride to go back to places like Guatemala. There are some countries that could use a lot of that, a lot of these folks back in their countries. I understand Guatemala has lost a lot of the labor force, people who were just kind of truck drivers, things as simple as just people who would, move cargo from one part of the country to the other weren't available. And so, do you see, people going back voluntarily? I mean, I know some might be forced, but do you see others going back voluntarily?
In principle, I don't. When I look back at the past 25 years, um, the issue of deportation has always been there. It's been heightened under different circumstances during former President Bush Jr. There were waves of deportations. Then you had former President Obama through one of the largest waves of deportation. Here we have 1 million people were deported every year for an extended period of years, at least 4 years. And people try to adapt to living basically in a context where there is the risk of being caught. It's significant. The fact is that people have to factor in fundamentally the cost of returning based on the obligations they have acquired in the United States. And it seems obvious when you think about it, but not when you don't listen to it, is that migrants adopt a number of financial obligations in the United States, like anybody else. So if you return to Guatemala and you have a $10,000 or $20,000 debt, you're not going to be able to pay that debt back that easily as you pay, $500 a month in that debt. You will not, because you will make $500 at post. So those factors really play a role in your decision to return. The other factor is if you have family, you have kids in school, it's not going to be easy to take your family back into a country where there is a remedial quality of education, and all those things matter. So the one mitigating factor that may push you to migrate, to return, is the politics of fear. And right now there is more fear than any other point in time, that makes people pretty scared that, I better go back. So that's lingering in people's minds, and people are basically being resilient about that. And so we'll see. I mean, really, it's a high risk probability.
So we're just about wrapped up. I always want to leave a little bit room at the end of the podcast episode to finish on a lighter note. I do feel like I'd like to invite you back later in the year, perhaps, to see where things are and just kind of revisit this, because I think there's a lot still to come. And I'm sure you're going to be very busy analyzing all the data and preparing for your discussions with government and other stakeholders. But I always like to finish on a lighter note every podcast episode since we started this about 2 years ago now. And I always ask a question related to one of my favorite topics, which is music. So I know that you studied at the University of Texas at Austin. You spent about 9-10 years there. Austin is one of the great American cities where live music, rock music, all kinds of music has thrived. Can you think about one of your kind of favorite memories about live music in Austin, Texas? Just to put you on the spot.
Too many.
I'm sure. Yeah. Anything that jumps out? Any band that you?
Those are some of the best memories in my life. Being at UT, a Longhorn. I love Texas. I love Austin. It's just like terribly wonderful going to the river to enjoy tubing with rolling rock beer and music. And we have so many kinds of music. There is a variety. Of course, I'm a big fan of Lyle Lovett. So
I love it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like him. But we had Lila Downs, and we have other performers, including Willie Nelson. So
you like you like country music and
I learned to dance country music. I mean, it's
bluegrass, folk. Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's country music.
10 years in Austin, I would imagine you would have to know how to two-step.
Oh yeah, no. It was fun. It was right. It was fun. Going to the broken spoke to dance, to step, and do a lot of country dancing. It was fun. I mean, a Latin
Fantastic.
person may surprise you dancing country
Sure.
music.
Yeah, fantastic.
And I still wear cowboy boots.
Do you really?
Oh yeah.
You're a cowboy. Well, listen, Manuel, this was very informative and insightful. I do appreciate your time. I know you're very, very busy, particularly in current times. So I appreciate you taking some time to speak with me today. I hope to bring you back. We can revisit some of what we discussed at a later date. I also want to thank those of you who tune in regularly. Stay tuned. We're going to continue to cover the Trump administration's policies and impacts on different sectors of the economy. And if you like what you listen and watch today, please subscribe at the link below. And we'll see you next time. Manuel, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to see you.